She treated a stranger in a military jacket against hospital policy. By morning, her story was all over the news, and her career was over. But the man she saved wasn't just any patient. He had a past the government tried to keep buried. What started as an act of kindness became a national secret. Watch till the end to see what happened next, and subscribe for more. Lauren Mitchell had spent most of her adult life moving through the narrow corridors of Riverdale General Hospital. Located in a tired Rust Belt town in southern Ohio, the hospital was a modest, overworked facility that bore the weight of generations. Riverdale wasn't large, just wide enough to have 2 high schools, a struggling newspaper, and a diner that hadn't changed its menu since 1978. At the hospital, everyone knew her name. She wasn't just another nurse in scrubs. She was the one who volunteered for holiday shifts, who remembered to bring an extra pair of socks in winter for the elderly patients, and who kept a roll of peppermint candies for anxious visitors. Her days followed a rhythm that was both exhausting and familiar. She began each shift by checking the whiteboard in the nurse's station, scanning the names, diagnoses, and notes scribbled in dry erase marker. Equipment buzzed quietly in the background: monitors, oxygen pumps, the soft hum of tired fluorescent lights. Her shoes, once white, had long turned gray with use, and her ID badge had a crack in the corner from years of being swiped against the staff entrance. She moved from room to room with practiced efficiency, her hands steady even when the noise around her wasn't. The staff was stretched thin. On good days, there were just enough hands to cover each department. On bad days, a nurse might cover 3 floors. Lauren didn't complain. Complaining wouldn't change the supply shortages, the outdated machines, or the way administration kept cutting corners to meet budget. She worked through it all: long hours, missed meals, and silent grief for patients she couldn't save. It wasn't heroism, it was survival. She believed, perhaps naively, that every act of care, no matter how small, mattered. Her own life was simple. After clocking out, she drove back to her small house tucked near the old railroad line that still ran freight every evening. The siding was faded, the porch steps creaked, and the mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Inside, her German Shepherd Max greeted her like clockwork, tail thudding against the floor. Her evenings were quiet. She brewed tea, always mint, and sat on the worn armchair by the window. Sometimes she'd read. Often she'd write in a spiral notebook, logging moments from her shift that she didn't want to forget. A smile from a patient who rarely spoke, a successful IV placement, a goodbye that felt heavier than usual. Lauren hadn't dated in years. Her husband had left her in 2006, and their son Jacob had moved to Texas after high school. He called occasionally, holidays, birthdays, but mostly there was distance. It didn't hurt as much anymore. The silence had become a fact of life, like the rain that came every April or the first frost in October. She had grown used to filling space with duty. That November day in 2017 started like any other. The morning air was cold and damp, and the hospital smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic. There were no alarms, no code blues, just the dull background of human weariness. She rotated medications, adjusted pillows, replaced IV bags, answered questions from confused relatives. By mid-afternoon, her feet ached, and her back reminded her she wasn't 25 anymore. Still, she kept going. That's what she did. She kept going. She had no way of knowing that someone would walk through those automatic glass doors by sundown and break that rhythm completely. No hint that a face she'd never seen would bring her entire world to a halt and force her to choose between everything she knew and everything she believed in. The sun had begun its slow descent behind the buildings of Riverdale when the pickup truck pulled into the hospital's worn and cracked parking lot. It was an old Ford, covered in a film of road dust, its paint dulled by years under open skies. A faded state flag sticker was peeling from the back bumper, flapping slightly in the late autumn wind. The truck idled for a moment before the engine cut out, leaving only the quiet hiss of cooling metal and the distant hum of an ambulance arriving at the back entrance. From the driver's side stepped a man who looked as if he had driven across half the country without rest. He was tall, with long limbs that moved stiffly, like they had forgotten how to bend properly. His face was sun-worn, sharp around the jawline, with gray stubble clinging to his skin. Sparse silver hair clung to his scalp, and his eyes darted with the unease of someone unused to stillness. His left arm was wrapped hastily in a piece of torn shirt fabric, the edges stained a dark rust color, and he kept his right hand pressed firmly against his ribcage. He wore a jacket that suggested military origins, its cut rigid, practical, but there were no patches, no rank, no identifying marks. just blank fabric and the weight of years. He crossed the parking lot in slow, careful steps, each footfall deliberate. The automatic doors parted in front of him, and for a brief second, the fluorescent lights inside washed over his features, highlighting the hollow in his cheeks and the grit in his expression. He reached the front desk, but didn't speak immediately. His mouth opened once, closed, then opened again, but whatever he intended to say was swallowed by the sudden tremor that overtook him. His knees buckled, and before anyone could react, his body collapsed onto the hospital's tiled floor with a dull, echoing thud. A nurse at the desk gasped. The receptionist froze. Chairs scraped as patients and visitors turned to look. Lauren had been walking past with a chart in her hands when she saw him fall. The moment she noticed the growing stain of blood seeping through the makeshift bandage, her body moved without waiting for permission. There was no time to check records, no need to ask questions. She called out to bring a stretcher and knelt beside the man, assessing his vitals, feeling the damp heat on his brow and the uneven rise of his chest. The charge nurse hesitated, and the attending physician barked from down the hall about protocol, but Lauren was already slipping on gloves, already cutting away the bloodied fabric to expose the wound beneath. The man was conscious, barely. His lips moved, but no sound came. His pulse was weak and thready. Whatever had happened to him had been festering for too long. Without immediate attention, he would not last the hour. Within minutes, she had stabilized his breathing, inserted a line, and issued instructions for surgery prep. Her colleagues followed her lead not because they agreed, but because something in her tone left no room for argument. The OR team assembled, and by the time the administrators were even notified, the stranger was being wheeled through double doors into the surgical wing. Later that night, when the worst had passed and the man was lying sedated in post-op, Lauren sat down to write her report. She reviewed what had been found in his pockets: a battered leather wallet with a few worn bills, a faded driver's license listing no current address, and a small plastic-wrapped memory card tucked behind a torn fold. There were no insurance documents, no emergency contact, just silence, and that single sliver of storage. She logged the details, closed the chart, and exhaled. The operation had gone well, internal bleeding had been controlled, and the infection appeared manageable. But something felt different. Not just about the man, about the air around him, the reaction of her colleagues, the way security had lingered near the door longer than usual, as if the edges of this event didn't fit within the usual borders of her job. She tried not to think about it as she returned to her station. In her mind, the only thing that mattered was that she had acted quickly, that he was alive, and that someone, whoever he was, had been given another chance. But deep down, even as she pushed the unease aside, a quiet thought lingered. Something had changed, and she didn't yet understand just how much. The following morning, Lauren was summoned to the office of the hospital's deputy administrator. The message had come without detail, just a brief note left in her staff locker, requesting her presence before the end of her shift. The office was on the third floor, far removed from the noise and urgency of the ER. It always smelled faintly of plastic and lemon disinfectant, sterile in more ways than one. The deputy sat behind a wide desk, papers neatly stacked, her expression unreadable. The accusations came in calm, rehearsed tones: unauthorized treatment, deviation from standard intake procedures, lack of proper patient documentation. Lauren listened without interruption, recognizing each phrase from previous disciplinary warnings that had never quite escalated. There had been a few over the years: notes about staying past her shift without permission, initiating comfort care measures without written orders, bypassing the chain of command when time was critical. None of it had ever seemed serious until now. This time, the consequences were immediate. 2 days later, she received a formal notice. Effective immediately, she was suspended from all hospital duties. Her badge was deactivated, her access to the patient record system revoked, her pay placed on indefinite hold pending further review. No mention was made of the man she had treated. No explanation was offered to her colleagues. To the outside world, it was simply as if she had vanished from the floor. The silence that followed was louder than anything she had expected. Her phone rang nonstop for the first 24 hours. Unknown numbers, local reporters, hospital staff trying to make sense of the rumors. She didn't answer. Then came the emails, the comments online, the threads on the town's community forum. People speculated endlessly about the man in the truck. Some assumed he was a wanted criminal. Others claimed he was a drifter who had faked his injuries. A few stood up for Lauren, praising her instincts, her years of service, her refusal to look away. But the dominant voice was one of suspicion. Why had she acted alone? Why hadn't she followed protocol? Lauren stayed inside. She unplugged the phone and left her laptop closed. Her dog, Max, paced the hallway, unsettled by her restlessness. She moved from room to room with no purpose, too distracted to cook, too tired to sleep. The order of her life had been broken, not by the injury she had treated, but by the machinery that had turned against her for doing so. One night, as the wind picked up and leaves scattered across the back porch, she noticed a plain white envelope wedged beneath her front door. There was no stamp, no return address, no name. Inside was a single newspaper clipping, yellowed slightly at the edges. It was from 2004, an article reporting on the conclusion of a U.S. Special Operations mission in the Balkans. The headline read, "Operation concludes without losses." The article mentioned no names, but the photograph accompanying it showed a group of uniformed men standing beside a helicopter. One of them, positioned slightly off-center, was unmistakably the man from the hospital. Younger, sharper, but the same angular jaw, the same eyes. She stared at the image for a long time, her pulse quickening. It wasn't just that he had once served. It was the quiet, deliberate placement of that clipping under her door. Someone wanted her to see this. Someone wanted her to know. She set the article on the kitchen table and sat beside it, the light above flickering faintly. The questions piled in her mind, unspoken but heavy. Who was he, really? Why had he come to Riverdale? And what role had she unknowingly stepped into by helping him? A week after her suspension, Riverdale settled into a strange, uneasy stillness. The late November skies remained overcast, casting a muted gray light over the town's narrow streets and empty sidewalks. The hum of daily life at the hospital continued, but beneath it, there was a current of subdued speculation. Something had shifted. Nurses whispered in break rooms, doctors spoke in clipped tones. The events surrounding the man who had collapsed in the lobby and Lauren's abrupt removal were still too fresh, too unexplained. Then, on a Tuesday morning, just after the early shift began, a black government-issue sedan pulled into the staff parking lot. 3 men emerged, all in dark suits and trench coats, each carrying a briefcase. Their movements were precise, deliberate, without hesitation. They entered through the administrative wing's side entrance, bypassing the usual reception area. Those who saw them said nothing, but watched with sharpened curiosity as the trio disappeared behind the double doors of the hospital's upper office suite. Inside, they met with the hospital's top executives. No receptionist buzzed them in, no assistant took notes. For over an hour, the doors remained closed. When they finally exited, no press release followed, no official statement circulated. The men simply left, slipping back into their vehicle, faces unreadable behind dark sunglasses. By midday, their car was spotted again, this time parked quietly on a residential street 2 houses down from Lauren Mitchell's home. Lauren had seen them. She noticed the car from her front window while reheating a cup of tea she had let go cold. The sedan had been idling there for almost 15 minutes, its engine barely audible. No one exited, no one knocked. The windows were tinted too dark to see inside, and when it finally pulled away, it did so without turning on its lights. It wasn't the first time she'd felt watched since the incident, but this was different. This wasn't rumor. This was presence. That evening, after the sun had set and the last of the neighborhood porch lights flickered on, a larger SUV appeared. It moved slowly down her street, its headlights off. The vehicle came to a stop near her driveway and remained there for nearly an hour. No one got out. No one approached the house. Then, without warning, the engine stuttered once, an abrupt cough of machinery, and the SUV backed out and disappeared into the night. The next morning, Lauren found a small, unmarked envelope tucked beneath her newspaper. Inside was a slip of folded paper, no signature, no heading, just 8 words printed in clean block letters. "You made the right call. Thank you." She read it several times, standing in the doorway, the wind rustling the trees in the distance. The message was clear. Someone had been watching. Someone had cared enough to leave her this. Later that afternoon, a local news station aired a short but pointed segment. A reporter, standing in front of a nondescript military hospital in Indiana, announced that a decorated former military operative, unnamed, had been inadvertently identified after seeking medical care at a civilian facility in Ohio. The individual, according to the brief report, had been part of a long-standing federal protection program. The hospital confirmed that the operative was in stable condition and had since been returned to an undisclosed location. No further details were provided. The anchor's tone, however, made the implication impossible to miss. Lauren watched the segment in silence from her living room, the soft glow of the television the only light in the room. The photograph from the newspaper clipping, now pinned to her refrigerator, flashed through her mind. There was no doubt now. The man she had treated was someone significant, someone who hadn't wanted to be found. And yet, through her decision, he had been. Just as the news segment ended, Lauren's phone lit up with a message from a former colleague still working at the hospital. "Something's happening. You should see this." 15 minutes later, Lauren stood behind her curtains, eyes fixed on the hospital parking lot. A black motorcade had arrived. 3 vehicles, sleek and reflective, rolling to a coordinated stop outside the main entrance. From the first car emerged uniformed officers in full military dress. Their movements were deliberate, their appearance pristine. Ribbons and medals gleamed beneath their coats, shoes polished to mirror shine. One of them, taller than the rest, carried a sealed envelope and a framed certificate. Staff began to gather inside the lobby. Nurses, doctors, administrative assistants. They lined the edges of the room in near silence. Patients peered through the glass from wheelchairs or gurneys, their expressions a mixture of confusion and awe. Cell phones were raised. No one spoke above a whisper. The officers entered without announcement. They moved past the front desk, past security, and directly to the office of the hospital director. The exchange inside lasted less than 10 minutes. What was said remained between them, but the effect was immediate. Staff looked on as the officer handed over the documents and turned to leave, his face impassive. No interview followed, no cameras. The gesture was the message. By dusk, the tone in the hospital had changed. Staff who had once avoided Lauren's name now whispered it with a different kind of caution. No longer was she the nurse who broke the rules. Now she was something else, someone who had stepped into a moment much larger than her role and done what few others would have. Though no public apology was issued, Lauren's reinstatement followed quickly. Her badge was reactivated, her email access restored. But what mattered more was the way people looked at her now, not with judgment, but with something closer to respect. She hadn't just saved a man's life. She had, unknowingly, protected a fragment of history meant to stay hidden. The changes at Riverdale General Hospital did not happen all at once. They unfolded gradually, like the quiet thaw of winter ice, subtle at first, then unmistakable. In the week following the military visit, the administration released a carefully worded public statement. The language was measured, but the message was clear. It acknowledged the value of professional judgment in high-pressure situations and emphasized the importance of compassion alongside protocol. Phrases like clinical discretion and human factor in emergency response appeared in internal memos and staff emails. It was, by hospital standards, a seismic shift. Lauren was officially reinstated 3 days later. The letter was formal, typed on hospital letterhead, and signed by the director herself. Alongside it came confirmation of back pay for the days she had been suspended, a quiet acknowledgement that what had happened was unjust. But there was no ceremony, no announcement over the intercom, no call for recognition. Her return to duty came the same way her departure had, quiet, direct, and without fanfare. When she walked back into the ER for her first shift, there was a moment of stillness among the staff. Some nurses looked up from their charts. A few offered hesitant nods. Others simply stepped aside to make room for her at the desk. There was no applause, no grand reception, but something in the air had shifted. The glances were different, less guarded, more aware. She didn't need validation. What she needed was to get back to work. In the days that followed, subtle changes began to take root among the staff. Younger nurses started asking more questions during rounds, seeking clarification on orders they once accepted without thought. Some began to spend an extra few minutes at a patient's bedside, checking in not just on vitals but on feelings, comfort, fear. A few even adopted Lauren's habit of carrying a small notepad in their scrubs, jotting down personal details, a son's name, a preferred meal, a birthday coming up. Doctors who had once been distant began pausing before signing off on standard procedures, listening more closely when nurses voiced concerns. The nursing station, which had often buzzed with complaints about workloads and time constraints, now included small exchanges about what truly mattered, moments of dignity, gestures of comfort, things that couldn't be measured on a chart. The administrative wing, once rigid in its adherence to rules, also began to soften at the edges. Policy meetings were held to revise emergency protocols, allowing room for staff judgment in scenarios where hesitation could cost a life. A new line was added to intake procedures, In cases of immediate threat to life, discretion may override documentation. It was just one sentence, but Lauren knew what it meant. It meant they had listened. She moved through her shifts with the same steady rhythm she always had, but now there was something firmer in her posture. She no longer second-guessed the instincts that had carried her through that critical moment. The hesitation was gone. She knew the cost of stepping out of line, but also the necessity. For the first time in years, she felt that her work mattered beyond the routine. One evening, after a long shift that ended just before midnight, Lauren returned home to find a small envelope tucked under her welcome mat. The handwriting was uneven but legible, written in blue ink on plain paper. The message inside was brief. "You didn't just save me. You reminded me that honor is not a forgotten word. Jay." She stood for a long time on the porch, the note in her hands, the cool night air brushing against her skin. She didn't know how he had found her address. She didn't know if she would ever see him again. But the words struck something deep inside her. They weren't just a thank you. They were a confirmation that the choice she had made, against every rule and warning, had mattered in a way few things ever did. Back inside, she added the letter to the notebook where she had kept her personal notes from patients over the years. It rested between pages filled with scribbles, names, details that would mean nothing to anyone else, but everything to her. Lauren didn't speak of the note to anyone. She didn't need to. She simply showed up the next morning on time in clean scrubs with her notepad in her pocket. And when she stepped onto the floor, she did so not as someone vindicated, but as someone certain of what she stood for. 4 months had passed since the storm, and winter in Riverdale was beginning to lose its grip. The snow had melted into memory, leaving behind damp sidewalks and puddles that mirrored the gray sky above. Rain had begun to fall again, soft, steady, unhurried. It tapped gently against the windows of the hospital, a familiar rhythm that seemed to echo the stillness inside. Lauren was on the evening shift, moving through the final hours with her usual quiet precision. The ER was calm but alert, a few patients resting in dimly lit rooms, others waiting silently with blankets pulled to their chins. The overhead lights cast soft halos on the polished floor. The buzz of monitors, the low hum of distant conversations, and the occasional squeak of shoes on linoleum filled the space with a kind of meditative routine. It was near the end of her shift when the doors to the emergency entrance slid open with a hiss. A man in his early 40s stepped inside, cradling a little girl wrapped tightly in a coat far too big for her. Her face was flushed, damp with sweat, her arms limp at her sides. He looked panicked but composed, the kind of fear that comes from knowing something is wrong but not knowing how bad. No one asked for insurance, no one reached for forms. A nurse stepped forward with a wheelchair. Another pulled a thermometer from her pocket. A young doctor approached with calm hands and clear eyes. Someone brought a warm blanket, someone else prepared a room. There was no debate, no hesitation, no reminder of policy. The patient was seen, the child was treated. The system moved as one, not with protocol, but with instinct, with care. Lauren didn't rush to the front. She didn't need to. The shift was happening without her intervention, and that, more than anything, told her that things had changed. The ripple of her decision months ago had become something larger than herself. Others had picked it up, carried it forward, let it shape the way they moved through their own days. She sat in the staff room, her chair angled slightly toward the window. The rain had picked up, and headlights flickered across the wet pavement outside, stretching and bending in the puddles. A cup of tea steamed beside her, half forgotten. In her lap, her notebook lay open, a pen resting in the crease. She wrote down the details of the evening, not just names and times, but impressions. The tension in the man's shoulders as he entered, the steadiness in the hands of the nurse who took the girl's pulse, the way no one looked for rules before acting. It wasn't just about procedure anymore, it was about presence. That was the word that had stayed with her since everything happened, being present, being willing. She had no desire to become a symbol or an example, but she had learned that even one act done quietly could make room for others to act too. She didn't know that the next morning she would receive a formal letter from a military hospital in California offering her a position on their permanent staff. She didn't know that it came with housing, relocation assistance, and the opportunity to teach new nurses about care under pressure. She didn't know that someone from that same hospital had been following her story since the incident in November and had waited for the right moment to extend an invitation. That night, all she knew was that the ER had returned to a different kind of normal. Not the normal of silence and fear, but one of attentiveness, of people seeing one another and acting because it was right, not because it was allowed. She closed her notebook, capped her pen, and stood. The tea had gone cold, but she didn't mind. She switched off the lamp on the desk and moved quietly into the hallway. Somewhere down the corridor, a patient was stirring, a call light blinking above a door. She walked toward it, steady as ever. Lauren Mitchell never needed recognition. What she needed was the work. And in that moment, on that rainy evening in Riverdale, she returned to it once more, not because she had to, but because that was who she had always been.